So we're going to continue on, and we're going to talk about designing incentives. Now, the purpose of incentives is to motivate action, and that means we should concentrate our incentives on the things that people can actually control. So that's one of our principles that we should use when designing incentives. Is concentrate our incentives on what people can control. Now, that actually is harder than it sounds, because often it's not clear what people can control. And people will have an incentive to claim that everything good that happened was a result of things that they controlled, and everything bad that happened was the result of everything outside of their control. But broadly speaking, there's two ways that we think of doing this. One way of concentrating incentives on what people can control is to compare people versus some benchmark. And the question arises, what should that benchmark be? And one way of looking at benchmarks is to look at internal benchmarks. And this is what's called tournament theory. That we have a group of people inside an organization who have similar positions, and we say, all right, we're going to rank them and reward them based upon their rank relative to each other. And this does a great job if all these people are exposed to a common environment. If they're exposed to a common environment, then any difference between them is either just pure dumb luck, and we can't sort of do much about that, or it's due to differences in their efforts and abilities. But the danger here is that we've pretty much undermined any sense of teamwork that they might develop here if we've made it that they're judged relative to each other. Not only will they have little incentive to waste their time helping each other, they may actually take time to undermine and damage each other. And anyone who's been in a large organization where people are vying for promotion to the same job is familiar with this sort of incentive mechanism that we've inadvertently created by using an internal tournament. So, probably better in most cases, where possible, to use an external benchmark. So let me give an example here. Suppose I'm the regional director or regional manager of, say, a large grocery chain. And I'm sort of thinking about how I want to reward the manager of each particular grocery store out there. I could go, okay, I'm going to rank you all against each other and pay bonuses or give a promotion to the one who performs best out of the whole pack, the one who has, say, the highest percentage increase in the sales of their particular store. That would create a lot of rivalry and bad feeling. Now, some degree of rivalry is probably okay. So a healthy rivalry, may be motivational, but if it's an unhealthy rivalry, that may not be so good. And of course, also, sometimes there might be some corporation-wide policy that either makes all of my stores in my region perform well, or all of the stores in my region perform badly. Better probably to look at an external benchmark, and here I might say, for instance, compare the sales at my store relative to sales in some other region that's not under my management. So in that case, if there's sort of a national advertising campaign that boosts the store's sales for all of the stores in our entire corporation, then all of my managers in my region are being affected by that, as are the managers in the other region. So when I compare to the managers in the other regions, then we're going to go ahead and see that people are not being rewarded for the fact that the whole corporation ran a good policy or the whole corporation ran a bad policy. And they're not going to be punished if, say, for instance, we end up in a situation where the external benchmark is not performing as well. So that's one way of looking at this thing. So we want to concentrate incentives on what people can control. So the sort of short version of this is concentrate incentives on effort. And we can't directly observe effort, so what results flow from effort. So really, that's what we end up doing. We often can't observe effort, and even if we could observe effort, if we could just sort of measure, well, how many hours overtime did you spend as a manager, that's not necessarily the best way to go about it, because we want to know that people are doing productive, mindful effort rather than just sort of logging extra hours, just to sort of show that they're, a hard worker. Okay. So the other thing to think about out there is how will people game these incentives? So whenever you sort of think about a set of incentives and sort of bringing that set of incentives to bear on a group of people, it's often easy to imagine that people will react to your incentives exactly like you want them to. But you want to remember that other people are people too, and they have free will, and they have plans and minds of their own. And so you want to use some emotional empathy and intuition and go, if I were in their shoes, how would I try to get the most out of these incentives with the least effort possible, or something like that. So you need to be able to sort of think about this and think it through very carefully out there. And this is sort of one of the reasons why strong incentives may look good at first, but once you start thinking about strong incentives, then that's going to create more possibility of gaming the incentives potentially than weak incentives. So you definitely want to think about that. And the author Malcolm Gladwell actually has sort of a great concept in one of his books. And his analogy is that, well, if you think about sort of someone who's in a position of higher authority relative to a position of lower authority, when the person in the position of higher authority designs an incentive, that's probably one of many things that they're responsible for managing. And so maybe 5 or 10% of their attention and effort goes into designing these incentives. But for the person who is operating under these incentives, 100% of their life may revolve around these incentives. So the person at the lower level actually has much more time and energy to think about how to game the incentives than the person at the higher level. So, you really want to be careful in thinking that your well-designed incentive is going to solve all your problems out there. Because, the person at the other end of it, has a lot of time to think about that. And this sort of thing comes up with, say, boards of directors versus CEOs. The board of directors are typically part-time employees, and they have jobs. And the CEO, on the other hand, that's their whole job. So who is going to spend a lot of time in designing and figuring out how to game the incentives? The board of directors isn't going to spend a lot of time figuring out how to design the incentives because they have day jobs. The CEO, on the other hand, is going to spend a lot of time figuring out how to game the incentives. Or likewise, say, for instance, the regulators of a utility versus the utility itself. The regulators don't have as much on the line as the utility itself. Or, your boss, your parents versus you. Your parents have jobs, and, they have lots of things going on. They have siblings and so on. They may set up incentives, and they may not realize how easily you can circumvent them and game them against them. So you really want to be careful about this, and I think be a little bit humble if you're in a position of authority that you think you can figure out the perfect incentive scheme that will give exactly the behavior that you want.